Here's some of the worms. Just showing some of the worms that I have here. These are red wiggler worms because you can farm with many different types of worms, but here in Florida, the best type of worm, in my opinion, is the red wiggler worm. And red wigglers, they have a reddish color, and in their body, they have, once they're adults, they have a little clitellum in their neck, and that clitellum has the reproductive organs. They have both male and female reproductive organs, and you do need two worms to have more worms develop. You can't just split one worm in half. Sometimes people think that they can split a worm in half and then they get two worms, and unfortunately, that's not the case. If you split a worm in half, you would only get half of the worm survive, and then the other half, unfortunately, wouldn't make it. So I'm gonna probably talk a little bit more about the anatomy of the worm for the next minute or so while people start arriving, and hopefully most of the people that registered can make it and we can start on time. So, as I was saying, the red wiggler worm has a reddish color, and also the anatomy of the worm, it's a bunch of muscles. So, each one of those rings that you see in the body of the worm, it's a different muscle that moves back and forth when the worm moves. And the worms also have little hair likes at the bottom of the worm. So, as I was saying, that's what kind of helps the worm move back and forth. And they do not have eyes. They have cells in their body that makes them photosensitive, which means that they're sensitive to the light. So that's why when you have your worm farm, you want to try to get a darker color, and the worms are most likely going to try to burrow under as soon as you take the lid off of your worm farm. And they also prefer to have moisture in their skin, so that's why it's important for you to keep your worm farm moist. And also, worms do not have lungs, they breathe through their skin, so you want to be careful on how you handle the worms. For the most part, I try to have my hands clean, or I try to wear gloves whenever I'm handling my worms, because unfortunately, if I have something in my hands that can harm the worms, I can maybe create something that I can avoid. So that's why, since the worms are very sensitive by breathing through their skin and by also having to keep that moisture in their skin, it's important for you to make sure, excuse me, that you keep your hands clean or you wear your gloves. Certainly, you don't have to. There's a few people that prefer to not use gloves at all, and that's also okay. So it's almost 2:05, so I'm gonna start with the class, and I'm gonna introduce myself first, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit about how I feed my worms. I live here in the state of Florida, so everything that I'm gonna talk about, it's gonna be about worms outdoors in the state of Florida. Certainly, whenever you're taking care of your worms, it varies on a state by state basis because the environment is different everywhere. And you want to keep in mind how the environment depends, makes everything fluctuate. Because your environmentals that you have to keep for your worm farm have to be within a certain range. So that's why I want you to be aware of that, because what I'm talking about, as I said a little while ago, it's to do worm farming in the state of Florida. So I moved here about 20 years ago from South America, from Colombia, And I went to high school in Clearwater. Then I went to SBC, and from SBC, then I transferred to USF, the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, where I got a degree in geography and a minor in environmental policy and a concentration in conservation of society and the environment. And I was vice president of the garden club. We turned a dirt lot into a food forest that we have right now over there. And that's where I started worm farming. I started getting involved with worm farming, and I realized that it wasn't something that a lot of people were doing, and it's something that helps deal with the issue of food waste. I was part of the Food Recovery Club and all these other different organizations that help with food waste. And I felt that I could also do something about it. So that's why I started Leica Worms, which is my company. And what I do with Leica Worms is that I transform food waste by using red wiggler worms. And the red wiggler worms digest the food scraps and then they turn it into nutrient rich soil that you can use in your garden. So worm farming is very, very similar to composting from the standpoint that you're gonna need the four main ingredients that you use with composting, which are carbon, nitrogen, water, and oxygen. So nitrogen, it's gonna be your food scraps. Carbon, it's gonna be your bedding. You can use untreated mulch or you can use cardboard. And then your water and your oxygen. So when you have a tumbler, when you do your composting, as long as you keep track of those four main ingredients, everything is perfect and you will be fine. And with worm farming, the difference is that you have to keep your worms in some type of worm farm because you need to control those environmentals that I was talking about earlier. So for worm farms, there are a couple of different options that you can use, and one of them it's one that you can excuse me that you can make at home. And I use tote. I'm gonna grab right now, and I use this storage container. It's about 18 gallons, so it's just a regular storage container. It has the lid, and then this is the base of the storage. So I drill some holes around it right over here. And I also added a spigot right over here, just because we want to make sure we drill all that excess liquid that we get from putting all the food scraps in there and for adding water in there. So that's one way that you can make a homemade worm farm. You can also use a 5 gallon bucket and do something similar where you can put those holes around the top part, and then you add that spigot at the bottom and you have that drainage that it's important to have. Or you can also order a worm farm online, and I have with me it's just the Vivo Sun. It's one of the different brands that has worm farms, and this is just a tray stack system worm farm that has the same idea of just one tree on top of each other. You have your drainage right over here, so you can collect all that liquid that it's your leachate, which is very different from your warm tea. And I will talk about that at the end. It's just important for you to be mindful of the difference. In these trays, the main thing to keep in mind is that they have holes at the bottom so the worms can burrow throughout the different trays. So if you see, there's all these different holes, and each one of the trays has those holes. So whenever you're feeding, you're adding your food scraps and you're adding your bedding, and then the worms are traveling through those holes up and down through all those different layers. And that way they are helping create tunnels that are gonna help the heat raise, and that's gonna help that decomposition process happen a lot faster. So once you have either one of those two worm farms, then you need your worms. Certainly some people do in-ground worm farms. You want to be mindful of where you place that in-ground worm farm and to make sure that there's some shade over those in-ground worm farms. You can go online and look up in-ground worm farms. There's all different kinds, so you can either order online or you can also make yourself by just drilling a lot of holes in a bucket or in a container and just put it in the ground. But with the worm farms that I just showed you, all you have to do is collect your food scraps throughout the week. So I have a schedule that works a lot for me, and I collect my food Monday through Friday, and I put it in a storage bag and I put it in my fridge. That way, I make sure that I don't have any type of critters or animals or maggots or fruit flies try to develop on my food if I keep it outdoors, especially here in Florida with the heat. It just attracts all kinds of different animals. So if you put that bag in your fridge Monday through Friday and then you feed on your weekend, you're making sure that the worms have the whole week to eat that food that you gave them on the weekend. And you also want to, if possible, weigh out the food to make sure that you keep track of how much food you're adding each week. Because at the end, when you're harvesting your worm castings, you want to make a comparison of the worm castings that you collected versus the food that you put at the beginning in your worm farm. So some of the different food that we want to avoid when we add food to our worm farm is oranges or lemons, because those can make the environment acidic and that can harm the worms. And in my experience, my worms usually don't eat any garlic or onion. I'm not sure why, but I just avoid giving them those type of food because it's just going to stay there. But everything else they eat, of course, similar to composting, we want to keep away meat, dairy, any food that's processed or food that's spicy or oily. So for the most part, I'm feeding fruits and vegetables to my worms from the food that I cook every day. And that's my nitrogen. So I'm collecting some of the food. I actually have a bag here with me, and it has some banana peels, it has an avocado shell, and it also has some shavings from some mushrooms. So I just have my bag of food that I keep in the fridge, and I'm gonna use that on the weekend when I'm gonna feed. And I also store my paper bags, my brown paper bags, my toilet paper rolls, my paper towel rolls, or my egg cartons, as long as they're made out of paper, so I can shred those up and turn them into the carbon that I need to add to my worms. So I do have a shredder. I place those items through the shredder and I turn this brown paper into this size. That way I can add that in there with the food for my worms. But something that I do before I add my brown paper, because I've noticed a difference, is that I set it aside in a container that has water and I let that paper soak up. And after the paper soaks up for a while and absorbs most of the water, I add it onto my worm farm. Because if I add my paper first and then I add my water on my worm farm, it takes a very long time for the moisture to be absorbed by the paper, and then I have a lot of water sitting at the bottom and it creates excess leachate, and we don't want to create a lot of leachate because unfortunately that can carry pathogens or bacteria that could be harmful for you. So that's why it's important for you to be aware of the different ways that you can make that bedding that you're going to be using moist for whenever you add it to your worm farm. Sometimes I also use untreated mulch that I get at a local garden. So if you're going to use mulch as your carbon or as your bedding, definitely try your best to get mulch that is untreated. And you want to be aware of the fact that you don't want to add your mulch without adding any moisture to it as well. So now the other thing that it's important for us to be aware of, in addition to the moisture, it's also the temperature. Because of course here in the state of Florida, unfortunately, at least 8 or 9 months of the year, it's very, very hot. So what I do is that if I have my worm farm outdoors, I have it under some type of shade. That way, hopefully, the temperature won't affect the worm farm as much. And I also have some of those blue ice packs, and I keep some of those in my freezer. And in the morning before I go to work, I add one of those in my worm farm. I definitely make sure to dig a hole or dig it in between all the medium and all the mix of the food and the bedding. Because if I only place it on the top part, on the top layer of the top tray, unfortunately, it doesn't really reach the bottom of that tray, and sometimes you can have heat spots all throughout your top layer. So it's important for you to be comfortable. Also, that's kind of also why I wear some gloves, because it's important for you to be aware of the temperature within that whole mixture. So with your gloves, you can kind of get your hands in there and dig in there and feel that temperature. And if you feel that it's hotter than usual, because it should be the average temperature for a healthy worm farm, for the most part, should be between 40 degrees and maybe 85 to 90 degrees tops. If it goes over those 90 degrees, unfortunately it's too hot for the worms and they can fry and die. So by adding that ice, or sometimes even by keeping your food scraps in the freezer and adding frozen food scraps to your worm farm, you can also lower that temperature of your worm farm, because you want to keep an environment that it's very comfortable for them, because that's what encourages them to multiply and reproduce. So we have the moisture, we have the temperature, and we also want to make sure that there's ventilation or there's airflow throughout the worm farm. So one way of doing that is by making sure that if it's one of the worm farms that you made at home, that the holes on the outside of the worm farm, that they're all clear, that they're not blocked, that you're not placing the worm farm in a place where the holes are maybe going to be blocked or obstructed. So make sure that those are clean. And if you have one of the worm farms that is the tray stack system, same thing, wherever you place it, you just want to make sure that there's nothing that's blocking it, or there's nothing that is stopping that airflow from going in and out of the worm farm. And as long as you're not overfeeding, you should not be dealing with any type of smells. You should not be dealing with any animal that it's not welcome in the worm farm. So whenever you're feeding your next feed each week, you want to make sure that you check how much food you have left from the previous feed. Excuse me. So if you have a lot of food still left over, unfortunately, you're going to have to wait a little bit more before you add that new food, because if you don't do that, then you're going to start developing some of that smell that you don't want to have in there. And then you're unfortunately probably going to have animals that you don't want to have in there. So again, put those gloves on, go in your worm farm, and just check. You can move stuff around, and hopefully there's only about 20% food left, and then you can add your new feed. If you see a lot more than 20%, then avoid feeding that one time, and then wait a few more days, 3 days, 4 days, and then check again and see if the worms ate some more of the food. If you have to wait a whole week, then we wait one more week and just make sure that the worms are eating, because that also shows that the worms are healthy, that they're satisfied with the type of food that you're giving them, because sometimes they're not eating as much because you gave them something that they don't really like. So you want to be mindful about the different types of things that you're adding into the worm farm. Sometimes I keep a little journal where I write down what type of food I add on my worm farm, just to keep track of what I gave them, because if at the end I want to send my finished soil to a lab and I want to get it tested and I have my results of the nutrient profile, I could compare that nutrient profile versus the food that I gave at the beginning, and maybe I can play a little bit with the type of food that I'm giving my worms, so I can get a specific final product to use on a specific plant, since sometimes different plants need different types of nutrients on different amounts. So with the food that you're giving the worms and the bedding that you're giving the worms, you want to make sure that you're giving a very either even ratio, or that you're giving more bedding than food. You want to avoid give more food than bedding, because again, that can also help some of that odor develop, and we want to avoid that. So once you have your worm farm and you're taking care of the environmentals, you're taking care of the food that you're getting the worms, you're making sure that the bedding that you're putting in there is moist and it's healthy. You want to be visible of any possible critter that's going to try to go into your worm farm that could either harm the worms or create an environment that could be harmful for the worms, because there's all kinds of different things that are going to try to go in there. Some of them are good guys that they're just kind of hanging out with the worms and eating at the same time with the worms. For example, there's some millipedes that you're going to find in there that are going to be having a lot of fun with the mulch. It's going to be springtails. There's going to be roly polies. There's going to be some spider mites that are going to be part of it. And those ones are very important to keep in mind, because here, at least in the state of Florida, in my experience, it's almost impossible to get rid of them completely. You still have to deal with the mites no matter what you do. So, in my case, here in the worm farm that I have, what I do is that I control their population. So instead of trying to completely eliminate them by adding the diatomaceous earth that's food grade to try to help them just break down and completely disappear, I try to control their population and make sure that they're at a minimum. So what I do is that I use either pieces of bread, a slice of bread of, or a slice of a rind of watermelon or cantaloupe. And then I place it on the very, very top layer of the worm farm where I have my top feed, and I leave it there for about a day. So I place it there in the morning and then I leave it alone. And then when I come back from work, I go back and check on it. And then when I lift it, it's covered with all the mites. So I remove it and then I place it in my composter. So pretty much what I do is that I relocate all those mites, because if I try to add a bunch of that diatomaceous earth, it, in my experience, it doesn't work long term. It might help for a short period of time, but again, the worm castings are so moist, and that makes sure earth works better when it's in a dry environment. What it does is that it makes the worm castings clump up, and the final product is not the same as if you would have kept the diatomaceous earth away. So be mindful of how you're dealing with the different things that could come up in your worm farm, just because if you're using different treatments that could affect your final product, then it wouldn't be good for you to use that in your plants, because the whole purpose of this is to create a product that it's clean, a product that it's organic, or a product that doesn't have any chemical fertilizers or any type of pesticides or anything like that. So that's why we want to avoid using any type of treatment that could either harm the worms or affect your final product. So another possible animal that's going to try to get in your worm farm, it's going to be ants, just because there's food in there and the ants want to, in my opinion, just eat everything. But the ants just, for the most part, are going to go for the food, but then they can also go for the worms, because I've had both things happen. So first I started dealing with the ants and I tried different things. I tried cinnamon powder, I tried mint, I tried oranges, tried something citrus, and unfortunately ended up attracting mice or rats, fruit rats, and they made a hole on the area where I had my worms in my worm farm. And none of those things unfortunately really worked. Not sure why it didn't work for me, because I know that it has worked for other individuals. And again, it could be the location, it could be because it's here in Florida, and Florida is slightly different environment from the other states. But the only thing that has really worked for me with my worm water. So I use this containers with water and I place it on the legs or the bottom of my worm farm, and that has kept most of the ants away, because the ants can't really, some of them try to drown themselves so they can create a trail, and then other ants walk over them to reach the worm farm, but it hasn't been as successful now, because I'm now using larger containers, and I also started using some oils in the water. So the water, it's a tougher mixture for the ants to try to walk through. So it's important to try to get those ants out of there and keep them away. I battle ants for about a year and a half until eventually, fortunately, I was able to figure it out and get them away. But they will be a big issue if you don't deal with them since the beginning. So that's why I usually recommend setting up those barriers that can keep these different invaders away. And then another one that I've dealt with here also in the state of Florida is the black shoulder fly. Black shoulder fly, it's perfectly normal to have either on your composter or just any type of food waste because the females are attracted by the smell. So they don't bite, they don't harm you, they don't really do anything to you. If they land on you, certainly don't feel that they're gonna do anything. They have a rather loud sound when they fly, which I think it's very, very interesting because it sounds very similar to a wasp or a bee. And they're also very, very large. These flies, compared with either fruit flies or just regular flies, these black soldier fly, you once you see it, and once you Google what the black soldier fly looks like, and then you see it in person, you won't forget it because it's a very unique. It looks, I think it looks pretty cool now that I've dealt with it so much. I've started liking it, and the black soldier fly, it's, as I said, it's attracted by the smell of the food decomposing, and it's just gonna lay some eggs. The eggs are gonna hatch, and then they're gonna start eating the food. It's perfectly normal because that's their purpose. The only issue is that if it happens in your worm farm, the maggots eat the food so fast that they raise the temperature of the worm farm. And by raising the temperature of the worm farm, unfortunately, since it goes sometimes over 100 degrees, that can really harm your worms, and we want to avoid that. So you can either get rid of the maggots by hand, which is what I did, and I don't recommend that to anybody, and I don't think anybody is willing to do that. So what I did is that I started adding a screen or a net around my worm farm to keep these flies away. They still land on the outside of the net, but since they're on the outside of the net and they're not touching any of this trash, leachate, liquid that they're attracted to, they're not leaving their eggs there and they're not hatching. So again, creating these barriers since the beginning when you're setting out your worm farm, either your homemade worm farm or the worm farm that you order online, you can have a more successful worm farming experience in the long term, because I've had some of my customers deal with some of these issues because they didn't set it up since the beginning with these barriers, and then they got frustrated and some of them quit, or some of them just got a little bit tired of having to deal with these things, and instead of enjoying worm farming, it turned into more of a task that they had to do. And I certainly don't want worm farming to turn into a task. I would prefer worm farming to be something that you enjoy. So I encourage you to try to set up that water trap, to set up that net, and to use either the bread or the watermelon to limit the amount of mites that you can have in your worm farm. And then hopefully you'll have a successful worm farming experience for the long term. So now what I'm going to talk about is how I separate my worm casting. So ideally, when you have your worm farm, you're going to be feeding weekly, and you're collecting your worm castings either once a month or once every 2 months. Sometimes I collect twice a month, but now I'm waiting a little bit longer. And the reason why, it's because I want to wait for the worms to digest the food and create worm castings for a little bit longer period of time. And so when you have your worm tower, you're going to have different trays. So you have your, let's say, 4 or 5 trays. And it's important for you to be aware of which tray you're feeding and which tray you're separating from the worm farm so you can harvest your worm castings. So when you have your worm farm, you have, as I said, you have your 5 trays. So for the first week, you're going to set up your first tray, and then you're going to put your lid on top of it, and then you're going to wait for the worms to eat all of that food. And right over here, this is the black soldier fly, actually perfect on screen. So I'm glad she joined us. So the first tray, Once you add your food and you add your bedding, you also want to add some either shredded eggshells or coffee grounds, because the worms eat very similar to the way that chickens eat. So they need some type of grit for them to use it within their gizzard and digest all the food. So when you add the eggshells and when you add the coffee grounds, you want to be mindful of adding it in smaller amounts, because you don't want to have them in a large amount, because it can create a nutrient toxicity. Because unfortunately, one time I got very excited adding coffee grounds because I thought that you could never go wrong with having more calcium, and I was totally wrong. I even worked at a grow shop where we had some plants have calcium toxicity, and I should have known better, but it's okay. It was a nice learning experience, and I put too many coffee grounds and I put too many eggshells, and unfortunately, when I had my final product and I sent it to the lab to get tested for my results, the calcium was just off the charts and all my nutrient profile was off the charts, and it was just not something that I could use. So it's why it's important for you to be mindful about the amount that you're adding. So I usually just add a couple of just a sprinkle of each one, just so the worms use it and they also like it. They like coffee grounds a lot. So just add it in smaller amounts. And again, make sure that you're feeding in the right order, because you're going to start with your first tray. You're going to put your lid, but once you have filled up the whole tray, then you're going to put your second tray on top. And then after you add your second tray, you're going to feed only your second tray that's on the top. You don't want to put your second tray on the top and add food to the bottom tray, because that can unfortunately mess with the whole cycle. You want to only add to the top tray. So this is your first tray. You have your food, you have your bedding, you have your eggshells, and then you put your lid on top of your worm farm. And then you leave it alone for the first week. Then another week goes by, you add new food, they put the tray back on top, and you also leave it alone. Let's say that now this first tray it's full. So now you're gonna add that second layer, which is that second tray, as I was saying, and then you're gonna feed on that second tray, on that second layer. And then the same thing with the third tray and the fourth tray and the fifth tray and with all the trays. Because if you do not keep track of how you're feeding and where you're adding the food, if you're adding it all throughout the different trays and the different layers, you're not gonna let the time that you need to go by for you to have your final product of your final worm castings. So it's important for you to be mindful, if you use the worm tower, that you're always, whichever tray you have on top of whichever tray you added to the top, that's the one where you're adding your food and your bedding each week. Now, once all the trays are full, you can harvest the bottom tray. So if you have your worm tower that has all of the four trays, and let's say you've used one tray per month, you've added one feed each week, and each month has 4 weeks. So as you're adding one tray per month and you have your four trays on month number 4, you're going to harvest the bottom tray. You're not going to harvest the second one, the third one, or the fourth one. Always harvest the bottom tray and always add food to your top tray. So once the 4 months have gone by, the food that you added on week 1 and month 1, it's going to transform into worm castings. And the worm castings look like this. So I brought some to show you. So these are the worm castings that I've been able to create, and they are pretty much living soil. They have springtails, they have millipedes, they have small roly-polies. There's no ants. Fortunately, I've been able to maintain it at a place that the ants have not been able to go in there. But when you have your tray that you're going to separate, you're going to have a mixture of the worm castings and the worms. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to do the separation. I know that that's something that most people have issues with or feel that it's challenging, and it is challenging, or more than challenging, it's time consuming, because you can try to feed the top tray to encourage the worms to move from that bottom tray and eat on the top tray so you don't have to separate as many worms. But in my experience, that hasn't really happened, because I've given my worms so much of the food that they like that they are reproducing constantly, and I have worms on all my trays. They're all spread out. The worms self-regulate their population, so as long as I'm giving them a good amount of food, I'm giving them the bedding that they like, I'm adding those coffee grounds, I'm adding those shredded eggshells, they're just gonna keep multiplying and they're going to keep reproducing, and usually between 30 and 60 days a population can double. So I have had a lot of population explosions that I'm very happy about. It's just that when it's time for me to do that separation, I have had to give a lot of my time to do that separation, because from all the different things that I've tried, I haven't been able to either get the worms to move to a different tray. I haven't been able to also use any of those sifters that sometimes people use. I feel that maybe it's because here in the state of Florida it's so moist, and my worm castings are also so moist, that any of those different sifters don't really let the amount of worm castings that I need to go through that sifter, no matter the different sizes of mesh that I could get, because I also use untreated mulch. And since my worms are reproducing so much, and it makes me very happy, I have a lot of cocoons. I don't want to lose the cocoons, and the cocoons are pretty much you could call that they're eggs, but they're where the little baby worms are, and it's what comes out of the reproduction of two worms that link together. So by having so many cocoons and so many worms that are different sizes, the sifter doesn't work, and the only method that I can do my separation is doing it by hand. So I have a tarp, and I use this tarp for the area for my separation, and I empty out my bottom tray for my worm farm, and I use the light method. It's really, really simple. It's just what it's called, the light method, because as I talked at the beginning of the talk, the worms are sensitive to the light, and they're going to start burrowing to the bottom of that pile of worm castings that you have. So what I do is that sometimes either I create different towers or different cones with the worm castings to allow the worms to burrow to the bottom, and then I start clearing my worm castings from the top, and then I start going to the bottom. So with my hands, I'm just separating that top layer very gently and very slow. Then I'm grabbing it, then I'm collecting it, and then I'm sifting, separating the worms, placing the worms in one container, and placing my worm castings in a different container. I also have used just regular tub that it's maybe 5 inches tall, and I've emptied my worm castings also in that tub, and same thing or same process. I've slowly and very gently cleared that top layer and moved it to one side of the tub. And you can see as you start removing that top layer, the worms start burrowing to the bottom. And after you have all of that in one side, I collect it, and then I sift it. I put my worms in my cocoons, if hopefully I have some cocoons, in a separate container, and then my worm castings in this other separate container. To be honest with you, depending on how well you're feeding the worms, depending on what you're giving the worms, you're either going to have a lot of cocoons, or you're not going to have a lot of cocoons, and then that's totally okay. You want to try, if possible, to give them some of their favorite food. It's usually sweet fruit. In my experience with my worms, what they like the most is either mango, papaya, cantaloupe, banana. So I try to cut them in smaller pieces. There's some people that blend the food. You don't have to do that, but if you want to, definitely go for it. You just don't want to add it in really large pieces. But Once you start collecting your worm castings and you start seeing the amount of worm castings that you have, you can compare it versus the amount of food, like I was saying earlier, and then you can see, well, if right now my worms are creating, let's say, 1 pound of food, and then I keep feeding them, and then I realize that I'm adding 1 pound of food at the beginning. Let's say I'm getting 1 pound of worm castings at the end. If I notice that the worms are starting to eat that 1 pound of food quicker than 7 days, then that means that they're starting to reproduce. And then you definitely want to start adding, instead of 1 pound, then maybe add pound and a half. And ideally, you're going to start collecting more worm castings. So by measuring your food and your worm castings, you're also able to figure out if your worms are reproducing, if you're creating more worm castings, and ideally that's the whole purpose of the worm farming experience, for you to create more worm castings. That way you can use them in your garden. So after you collect your worm castings, you do want to store them in a container that, again, it's elevated and it has a base that has some type of water to keep the ants away, because ants are also going to try to go in your soil, because they're going to try to eat all those different critters that are in there. I've had it happen to me. I had a bunch of ants go in one of my containers that had worm castings, and they ate all of the little springtails and small roly polies. It was very interesting because it was, I could watch it, and it was really unique. So just try to keep the ants away from your worm farm and also from your collected worm castings. And then once you have your worm castings, you want to be aware of the fact that they're very high in nutrients. They have high water retention capacity. They help your worms grow bigger, stronger, prettier, better, and they're going to help your plants flower much faster. So because they are so rich, you want to be mindful of how much you use. So you can go online, and there's many different sources that tell you what ratios of worm castings to use in your soil mix, because you can use the worm castings multiple ways. One way, it's for you to just add it to the base of the plant in its true form. So you would grab these worm castings that I have right here, and you're going to add this to the base of the plant or the base of the stem. And then you're going to cover that with some of the mulch that hopefully maybe you have on the base of the plant. Because if you do not cover it, the worm castings will most likely get direct sunlight, and if they get hit by direct sunlight, unfortunately that's going to make those nutrients last a shorter period of time, and we want them to last as long as possible. So you can, as I said, you can either add them in their true form to the base of the plant, or you can also mix them with water. You can mix these worm castings with water, and you can make worm tea, because it's important for you to be aware of the difference between worm tea and the leachate, because the leachate is the excess juice that comes from the worm farm, from the bottom of the worm farm, from that spigot that we either added to the worm farm that we made, or from the one that we bought online. And that leachate does have pathogens and bacteria that could be harmful for you. So that liquid you can place around your garden, in your non-edible plants, in your ornamentals, in your exotic plants, in your pollinators. But if you have a garden that it's edible, you want to make sure you only use your warm tea. And there's many different ways for you to make warm tea. You can go online, and you can go on YouTube, you can go down the rabbit hole of warm tea, and there's just all these different things that you can add to enhance your warm tea, that you can use as a liquid form, and you can add it to the base of your plant. You can top dress the base of the plant, or you can also add it to a spray and spray your plants. I've used it as both, and it has worked great. Just be aware of spraying your plants. You want to do it either very, very, very early in the morning, or when the sun goes down, because you don't want that spray to maybe harm your leaves, because once the sun comes out, those drops can turn into spots that are going to stay there, and we want to avoid that. So maybe do it after the sun goes down, and spray your plants with the worm castings, with the worm tea, I'm sorry, and the worm castings that mixed with water. So you can grab a 5 gallon bucket and use a 16-ounce cup of worm castings, dump them in there and mix them with a stick and pour them out. Or you can get a water pump and add oxygen to your mix of worm tea, and you can add molasses, you can add all these different things that people do to enhance their worm tea, and then you can add that to your edible garden, because that's definitely going to make the plants just grow stronger, and everything, it's also going to taste better, because in the garden at school at USF we used our worm tea a lot, especially on our mango tree, our avocado tree, our mulberry tree, and everything was, and our banana trees, those were my favorite, and everything just had such a sweeter flavor, and it was just rich and very, very unique. So I encourage you to make some worm tea, and you can also create your own soil mix. So there's many different ways that you can create your own soil mix. So ideally, when you're making your worm castings, you're creating a product that's eventually going to keep you away from going to the store to buy a bag of soil that has chemical fertilizers that are going to eventually end up in our waterways or in impervious surfaces after it rains, that we really don't want. So you can go again online and find all the different types of soil mixes that you can make with your worm castings, because depending on the type of plant, you want to make sure that you make the ideal type of soil mix. I have used different things. I've used cocoa coir as an ingredient, untreated mulch, rice husks, or I talked to a couple of breweries where they gave me some of their they brewed the beer, and I used that as some of the mix. You can also use perlite, and you add your worm castings into that mix, and you make your own soil mix, and you're growing your own plants with your own soil, and you're guaranteeing that they are not going through any type of soil that can have chemical fertilizers. So I certainly encourage everybody to do some worm farming, so you can transform your food scraps into nutrient rich soil. You're keeping that food away from the landfill. You're not throwing it in the trash anymore. So you're doing something good for the environment. The worms are very grateful little beautiful animals that are going to create those worm castings, as long as you keep feeding them, as long as you keep healthy environmentals, as long as the temperature is right, as long as the moisture is right, as long as the air and the ventilation is right. They're going to be very, very happy, and they're just going to keep making those worm castings. And you just want to make sure you make that separation at the end, so you have your container with your worm castings, and then ideally you make your own soil and you grow your own plants with your own soil. I am very happy that I'm able to do this. I am very grateful that I also have an extra source of income, because I decide what type of events I want to join. I decide what type of customers I'm going to serve. I have set up worm farms at different schools, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools. I've set up large scale. I've recycled bathtubs that I've set up at Acre College and other colleges. I have also given classes to different garden clubs or different types of organizations, nonprofits, and I've also pitched on different places. So I certainly encourage you to get involved with worm farming and get excited about the idea of transforming your own food scraps and making your own soil. So if you want to, you can sell the soil, you can sell the worms. I've created projects where I've mailed worms all throughout the country through Reddit, because I was going on a trip to South America and I had to figure out where to put my worms, and everybody shared some of their information on that was a black star they fly on how they feed the worms, and it was exciting to see how everybody has used anything they could to create a worm farm. So I encourage you to do it. So thank you so much for joining me today. All of my social media, it's like a worms. I have TikTok, Facebook page, YouTube channel where I talk a little bit about what I do with the worms. And I am very grateful that Food Waste Prevention Week gave me this opportunity. So certainly maybe find a garden nearby. Don't feel intimidated about doing worm farming at home. If you feel that this is too much, then it's totally okay. Find a garden where you can bring your food scraps and maybe create new relationships, find new friends that love the environment and love doing something for the environment. Really happy that I can do it through food waste, and worms are a really special animal for me. So thank you so much, and I appreciate if you follow Like a Worms, share this video, give a shout out, or I also take donations in a Buy Me a Coffee page that you can find somewhere on the links under my YouTube profile. Thank you.